So anyway, as I said, this Senate hearing is going on even as I speak, and the Kavanaugh's accuser may any moment now actually be allowed to testify. Right now, various senators are making statements. But are you, by the way, are you at all tuned into this whole thing?
A little bit, like I think you kind of explained that to me, but I think there were developments in between our conversations. There was another one that came forward.
Yeah,
Four people now.
but this woman testifying today is still the heart of the whole thing. Either she's going to come off as credible or she's not, and that's going to determine a lot. And but I guess I was going to say, like, the whole Kavanaugh thing has been kind of an exercise in the difficulty of mindfulness in a way. I mean, I oppose his nomination on ideological grounds, and the more I learn about his past, I mean, including his professional past, not just his personal past, the more opposed I am. So, I come into the news with that perspective, and the usual kind of cognitive biases are in play, which is to say, I see some news that seems damning, and I kind of embrace it and want to believe it. And then, questions may arise about it only later that make me realize I possibly shouldn't have grasped it so uncritically in the first place. I mean, there's this third accuser, third or fourth, it's getting hard to keep track, but who was brought forth by Michael Avenatti, the lawyer who represents Stormy Daniels and so on. And she, there was this, she did this affidavit that seemed very damning, and he had presented a profile of her that seemed compelling. She's risen so high in government that she has security clearance. And she said she had witnessed a number of things at a number of parties that Kavanaugh had in his high school years, that very, very damning accounts. But then the Wall Street Journal ran this piece about her that, raised some questions. For example, she graduated from high school 3 years before him. So, so by the time the events recounted by the first accuser, she was well out of high school. Was she still in the high school party circuit? She's had kind of, I guess, run-ins with the law, and there's just all kinds of things that whether or not they should impugn her credibility, you realize that, well, as the narrative is gonna play out, she's not going to be as powerful a witness as we thought possibly. The point is just, you find yourself doing the usual things, uncritically embracing the evidence on your side, wanting to dismiss any evidence on the other side. And meanwhile, you realize, like, that it's not even clear that Kavanaugh going down would be a good thing for your ideology if you, like me, oppose his nomination, right? Because you realize, well, most of the people that you might expect to be nominated in his place would be, from my ideological standpoint, as bad as him, if not worse. So it's like, question is what's gained. There is this scenario whereby the Democrats could conceivably take the Senate, and that might result in them being able to stop this Supreme Court seat from being filled by a Trump favorite. But that's a long shot, and you realize that, oddly, Kavanaugh going down could make that even less likely that the Democrats would take the Senate, because it may energize the Republican base and so on. Anyway, you realize there are all these different ways this could play out. Kavanaugh's going down could play out, and it may depend on whether, on how he goes down and so on. It's a reminder. I mean, I still, my own suspicion, and again, I have not yet seen his accuser testify, because that's happening like right now. I'll have to see it on YouTube. But my guess is that something happened there, and whether or not she has all the details right, it does not reflect favorably on him. It does not suggest that he's the kind of person who ideally you would have on the Supreme Court. And so I'm guessing there's something to the accusations, but the point is just that it's only on reflection, when you kind of pause and try to get some distance, you realize that you don't know for sure what happened. You don't know for sure who's right. And you don't even know whether it's good that the person you ideologically oppose going down is actually good for your ideology, because of how complicated these things are. And none of this is reason not to stay somewhat engrossed in the story, but it is reason not to let it completely dominate your consciousness, as this particular story has kind of had a tendency to do. I mean, it's hard for you to appreciate in Russia how pervasive this has been. And so the question is, could I have spent less time on social media focusing on this and spent the time more productively? And I think the reason to say yes is that other things have been happening in the Trump administration that deserve attention. I mean, Trump went before the United Nations and gave a talk, and even chaired a Security Council meeting, God forbid. And I mean, just the thought of him in such a high gravitas situation, is almost disturbing. But anyway, he used the time to continue to, in effect, agitate for regime change in Iran. And other administration officials have been doing that. They're turning up the screws economically on Iran. And John Bolton in particular, National Security Advisor, is making all kinds of noises, suggesting possible military intervention. And this is like the next big catastrophe that could happen. I mean, whether or not we wind up bombing Iran, which is completely without justification, we are trying to engage in regime change through economic strangulation, which is also unjustified. And not only are we sanctioning Iran, we are sanctioning all companies that have the audacity to do business with Iran. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and the Iran thing is, well, I mean, I'll stop there, but there's one other thing about the Iran thing, but that's, it's, I mean, the Kavanaugh thing is a genuinely big story, but it has probably dominated my consciousness more than is optimal, not just for purposes of my own use of time, but it has dominated it to an extent and in a way that makes it hard to maintain perspective on this particular story.
Mm-hmm. So I tried to count like different issues that I think are intertwined here that you're bringing up, and I think I counted 4. This last one is, should we allow this story to dominate, our attention so much? And that to me is almost like there's a more general question: should any news story dominate you completely for, days in a row? And my sense is, honestly, like, unless there's a war or revolution going on, there's not like, there are 24 hours in a day, and the developments on a news story, usually you might have, 2 updates in a day. And even if you do get them, the second they appear, I'm not sure if that's going to affect your thinking on that or change the way you behave or actually, yield something useful.
I mean, I would just intervene quickly and say that from the perspective of a lot of people, this is a war, because this isn't just a Supreme Court justice. This is about the whole Me Too movement and women who have suffered various kinds of abuse and harassment. And so it's not, this is a good candidate, I think, for getting preoccupied with, especially if you identify personally with the particular movement. This whole year has been like a watershed in America in terms of the amount of attention paid to this whole business of men in one sense or another harassing or abusing women sexually, especially men in positions of power, which is this particular case is a little different from. But this is a genre of abuse that is a big problem. Just men getting drunk and using, physical force or intimidation. So anyway, I would say that, but go ahead.
So there's that. And then the three others are, connected to the case directly. And let me see if I remember the things that I've thought about. So one is what actually happened. And it sounds like we might not ever know for sure. The issue is like what we're going to be convinced by, but it's not like it's not going to become, seems like a criminal case where this is like a, direct.
There won't be enough evidence for that. And I mean, the statute of limitations, I'm sure has rendered that moot by now, but yeah, there isn't that much evidence. The circumstantial evidence suggesting that, yes, the culture he was swimming in is very much the kind of culture in which something like this could happen. There's various evidence that he himself was kind of a bad drunk and so on, but testimony to that effect at least. But anyway, go ahead.
So that is the next question. And that one I'm not clear on. So how big of a, so the Supreme Justices are supposed to be people of very high standard, correct moral character and so forth.
You'd hope.
Is that, are people in agreement on the current state of the situation? Not Kavanaugh, is the credibility of the Supreme Court currently really high and people actually trust these people to be of high moral character?
Well, famously, there's one guy sitting on the Supreme Court who is subject to the very much same kinds of questions. Anita Hill came forward decades ago to question, to raise questions about the character of Clarence Thomas, saying that she had been subject to sexual harassment when working for him. And so there are, and I think, I believe her. This wasn't the same as attempted rape, which is basically what we're talking about here. And actual sexual assault, forcing a woman down, putting your hand over her mouth to keep her from screaming. But there is that. We don't, the other thing is, we don't know what kinds of questions would be raised about past justices if it were easier for individual citizens to raise them and get them, prominent attention. It's easier now. Now, interestingly, the other thing it's easy to do now is just document a lot of stuff because of email and so on. But this particular event happened in the 80s before there was email, before there was so much video documentation of things. So there's just not much evidence. But you can expect maybe in the future, more questions to be raised. I would certainly say this guy had presented a kind of a Boy Scout choir boy image that seems to have been manifestly misleading. Now that we know more about his social habits and things he wrote in his yearbook and stuff.
It's difficult for me, outside of the country and the culture to understand all of the context, and I kind of fluctuate between, how should I put it? It's either there's a whole lot of raping and abuse going on that has been like for decades, almost a part of the culture, or certain pockets of the culture that was kind of like glanced over, or there's less of that actually happening, but there is a lot of stories that accusations that once somebody is accused, it's difficult to wash yourself off these kinds of accusations. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, so for example, with this situation with Kavanaugh, it almost becomes to me like a question: either there is this great institution, the Supreme Court, and generally the system of government that should be protected from people of these vile people, or maybe the whole system is kind of rotten, at least to some extent, and has been that way, and we're now seeing how bad it actually has been.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I mean, as I said, in previous ages, you just knew less, I think, about the past of people. That's one thing. And the Supreme Court was shrouded in a kind of mystique.
Mm-hmm.
And so that and there may be some virtue in preserving a certain kind of reference for the very apex of the judicial system. I don't know, but I mean, I think as far as the Me Too movement more broadly, I think a number of things are going on. Men in power who have gotten away with a lot of stuff are having more trouble getting away with it, precisely because it's easy. There's more evidence of things that actually happened, and it's easier for relatively powerless women to get their accusations some airtime. I think it's also true that men often don't understand. Sometimes it's sometimes they do just misread signals and think that, oh, I can. Not that, oh, I can, I can start groping her now, but I mean that for them to like engage in a little innuendo verbally is like kind of what's wanted. And they may be wrong, because, a subordinate at work is going to behave toward you, in a way that that you should not assume conveys sexual interest, but you may confusedly think does, right? I mean, I realized this some time ago when, I would have interns long ago when I was like at a magazine, and there's the temptation to do that. A young female intern, this is before I was married, she'd come into your office and she's like very subservient, and you're thinking, is she interested? And then you go, wait, she's behaving exactly like the male interns. And I don't, it really, I mean, that's what she's doing. Right. She's just acting subordinate. And when the male interns do that, I don't think, hey, maybe they're romantically interested in me. So, it is, signals can be misread, and then also the rules of the game are changing. There are things that happened that, when I was young, that if they happened now, they would raise more eyebrows. I mean, when I was in high school, if you heard some guy say, yeah, I took her out and got her drunk and tried to see how much I could get, I heard that all the time. And okay. you might be someone who disapproved of that, but you wouldn't think, oh, I should report that, right? You wouldn't think, oh, that's rape. Nobody would have thought, well, I mean, okay, if she's like comatose, maybe somebody would have, I mean, I like to think we had some baseline sense of moral propriety, but I'm just saying the rules have changed. And that's good. I think that's good. But I think men are getting used to it, and particularly in the workplace, the rules are changing in terms of how careful you should be about what you say. And I think that's by and large good. But it is a period of adjustment.
So you said that Kavanaugh was you phrase it something like a part of a culture where, not Boy Scoutish culture.
Yeah.
What, can you explain that to me?
Well,
Because
he was a jock, and I
right.
know, like in high school, I was in the basketball team, so I was hanging out with jocks. We drank a lot. I mean, I didn't drink a ton, but we drank, and we drank to get drunk. And he was part of that kind of culture. He was captain of the basketball team, football player, scholar, a good student, smart guy at an elite prep school. But he was in the jock culture and clearly was advertising it. Like you write things in yearbooks sometimes. I mean, I don't think we did, but you can choose to write little things next to your picture. And he wrote a number of things that in retrospect are references to the drinking culture. He was in the Ralph Club. Ralph is like a synonym for vomiting when you're drunk. Ralph, you say, oh, he's calling Ralph. If you listen to what it sounds like when a guy, this is how this arose. Oh, he's calling Ralph. You hear a guy like vomiting. Okay, that's how that started. He's in the Ralph Club. He's in the 100 Keg or Bust Club or something. He's in, and then there's this cryptic thing where a series of F's that. And I think there's a reference to Devil's Triangle. Well, if you Google Devil's Triangle in the Urban Dictionary, you'll see something that is not definitions that are not what you'd hope to be alluded to by a Supreme Court justice, and are actually consistent. One of them is consistent with the initial allegation against him. But are you Googling it?
I just read the definition.
Okay, so you're reading the definition, and when you understand that one of the allegations is that two guys tried to rape a woman, it kind of fits in, right? The Devil's Triangle thing. And I haven't heard of, there's only two definitions in the Urban Dictionary, and another one alludes to sex with a woman of a kind that your average woman wouldn't be enthusiastic about. So he was in this culture, and that's, I don't know what, that wouldn't put him away in a court of law, but it all, it's all tarnished his image, and some of this is consistent with the accusation against him, and tends to, at least in an oblique way, I think, add a measure of some corroboration.
I don't know if this is too much of a tangent, but do you think there should be a larger conversation about what college culture is? So for me, one thing that has always been confusing, that's just not part of the system here, is the connection between professional sports and colleges. There's just there's more of a logical connection between, American football and brain trauma than American football and higher education.
Yeah.
I don't see how these two really come together. I mean, I understand the business part of the
connection. Let alone the connection between college sports and there has long been in America an unusual degree of emphasis on college sports. And in some realms, high school sports. I went to high school in Texas, and Texas football, you can't believe, every Friday during football season, they would disrupt the whole academic schedule to devote an hour to worshiping the football players. So every class would be 10 minutes shorter so that we could spend the morning worshiping the football players every Friday in the fall.
Does that seem a little fucked up to you?
Well, at the time it did, because I played basketball. We only got one pep rally the whole year. And we're still, at least one of the years, when the pep rally happened, I was away at a math tournament, so I didn't even get that. Not that anybody gave it, basketball players didn't get much adulation anyway in Texas because it was all about football. But that's a weird, and if you ask, I think colleges and high schools, they could do things to reduce the level of the pedestal that jocks are on. And if you look at the way many jocks behave at colleges and high schools, and I've been to both, and the way their behavior influences the value system, there is a strong case for for colleges doing these things to lower the pedestal they're on. But even at the elite, even at Ivy League schools, now it's not nearly as crazy there as it is at other schools, but they devote a lot of resources to having a winning football team. Mm-hmm. In terms of just how many people they let in who on academic grounds alone would not get in. Now they, so you could argue about that. There's one other point I want to make about Kavanaugh, which is, I think, one kind of line of defense of him that it's kind of tempting to buy, but I think you shouldn't ultimately buy, is like, hey, he was in high school. He was trying to prove to the other guys that he was a guy. So he would go out and get drunk. And when you're drunk, how many of us haven't done stupid things when we're drunk? That's a kind of defense that, I find in some ways appealing, because I was in high school trying to prove that my manhood to the other guys, to the more manly guys. I also actually enjoyed drinking. It's not like it was all an act, but I understand that, that you are susceptible to kind of a gang mentality when you're just trying to fit in with the guys and prove your manhood. And you may wind up doing things that you wouldn't do on your own. Now, in this case, I don't think that's quite what's even being alleged. What's being alleged is he was super drunk. Not that, not that he was having compunction about this, but did it anyway. That's not the allegation. At the same time, there's a kind of defense of him that's like, think back to when you were in high school, you did these things, you wanted to fit in, you drank too much. Should we really hold him accountable? The reason I think that is just not a valid defense is that let's just pick any criminal in one of our prisons and go back and look at the actual circumstances of their life that led them to be in jail, right? Probably started out in high school. They're trying to fit in. They can fit in with a crowd that doesn't respect the law as consistently as you might like. Maybe they wind up in a gang, whatever. The point is, all of us are victims of our environment, and it starts. And a particularly volatile and dangerous environment is the environment of our adolescence. That's what tends to lead people astray, and it's just kind of sickening to think that because the people now passing judgment on Kavanaugh can relate to the particular kind of corrupting environment he was in and can't relate to the kind of corrupting environment that lower income people are in, and often like African-American lower income people are in, to think that he's going to get a free pass and they don't, just because of the particular nature of the corrupting culture, I don't buy that.
Well, it also sounds to me like, that's the line of argument that you just presented might be a case for a kind of like Christian forgiveness or something, but not.
Well, fine. Either forgive everybody or nobody, and
right.
And I think
and then forgiveness usually comes after like an acceptance of guilt.
Exactly. I think the appropriate attitude, given how we are all in some sense victims of our environment and of our genes. Like I have a temper. Part of that's probably genetic. It could get me into trouble, has gotten me into trouble, just not criminal trouble, and so we're all victims of some combination of our genes and our environment. But I think the appropriate response to that is, okay, we still need to punish people sometimes when they do bad things, both to keep them off the streets if they're inclined to do bad things again, and to send the message that you should really try not to do bad things. Fine. But first of all, the punishment should be consistent. And if misdeeds can get certain kinds of people in prison, I don't see why, misdeeds can't keep you off of the Supreme Court. Again, if we have a reasonably clear idea of what happened, and I don't purport to know for sure. As I said, the key accuser is testifying even as we speak. I haven't seen the testimony, but I think the punishment should always be in some sense regrettable. We are doing it as a practical necessity,
right?
While at the same time, having the kind of compassion for the criminal that is appropriate, given the fact that if we had been born in their exact shoes, with their genes and their environment, we would have probably wound up in exactly the same place, because I don't know what there is other than genes and environment. Maybe there's something, but in any event, I mean, leave aside the question of kind of like free will and stuff. The fact is, we know that being born into certain kinds of environments gives you a strong statistical likelihood of winding up in certain kinds of bad situations and doing certain kinds of things that can get you in jail. We just know that. We know what the risk factors are. And so for that reason alone, I think punishment, we should think of as a regrettable necessity. And the punishment should never exceed what is practically necessary. In other words, retribution per se, I just don't think is a valid reason to punish someone.
I don't know if, not putting a person on the Supreme Court is punishment per se.
Well, it's a kind of punishment, but it's not the same as solitary confinement. Yeah. Exactly. It's like you'll live, It's an honor. It's not a denial of a basic human right to keep somebody off the Supreme Court.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. So the other thing that you brought up is sort of strategic thinking about the situation, whether, let's say, we don't get Kavanaugh, we might get somebody worse. Are these things, I mean, do you think these two issues should be considered separately, though? Because
no. I mean, my point about that is really just like, it's not that you should say, wait a second, if Kavanaugh goes down, that increases the chances that the Republicans will take the, keep the Senate and blah, and like, so then we shouldn't try to, stop his appointment in the Supreme Court. No, it's just more like, it's a reminder that the ramifications of things are, sometimes kind of so hard to I'm getting kind of bright here, are so hard to kind of, outline with any confidence that you just shouldn't get too wrapped up in anything, just like, do the things that you're pretty sure will lead to a better world in the long run, which can certainly include opposing the guy's nomination. But I mean, if you're somebody like me, it's like, I'm not out marching or doing anything to actually impede, his appointment. And so I shouldn't get too distracted from the things I do focus on, right, and try to have more expertise about, like, foreign policy and, and so on. I mean, the other thing is just like the current conversation on Kavanaugh. You go on Twitter, and it's just like, you would just be a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's just it's tribal conflict, and it's like, how much influence can you have? But that's all. I was just, it's good to remind yourself whenever you're getting too, whenever you find yourself just completely obsessed with the outcome of any given thing, or trying to make some big decision, and it's like, should I do this? Should I, and it's good to reflect on the fact that the actual consequences of specific things are very hard to suss out, So one thing I wanted to add, and I don't know if we'll stick this into the conversation where it belongs or at the end, but if it seems abrupt, it's because we stuck it into the conversation where it belongs. I had one afterthought on this whole business of, like, getting obsessed with Kavanaugh and the difficulty of kind of figuring out what the long-term ramifications of one outcome will be or another. It just occurred to me that one of the outcomes of his going down, if he indeed goes down and doesn't get the appointment, one of the more predictable ones is not in the realm of politics, but in the realm of norms. Like, when something like this happens and somebody suffers the consequences, even for something done a long time ago in an inebriated state, it does underscore that the rules are changing. That we're more careful in the way men treat women in these kinds of contexts than we used to be. To put it in concrete terms, maybe even kids in high school, as kind of mindless as you tend to be in high school, will think, well, one way or another, it could come back to haunt me if I don't treat somebody respectfully in some kind of situation. So I guess that seems to me a little more predictable than the question of, like, well, which Kavanaugh outcome helps the Democrats in the midterm as opposed, it's a little easier to predict. I mean, it's complicated because these things too can have backlashes. But my sense is that the upshot of the Me Too movement so far has been to make some men more careful than they might have otherwise been. In other words, to underscore a norm and a change in a norm. And that probably would be the result of this happening. If Kavanaugh goes down, as we record this, we don't know what's going to happen. I had neglected to say that.
That makes sense.
Okay, so we're done.